Justin was born in Flavia Neapolis, modern Nablus in the West Bank, around 100 to 110 CE. This location is highly significant for his identity. Flavia Neapolis was founded by the Emperor Vespasian in 72 CE on the same site or close by to the Samaritan city of Shechem, which had been destroyed in the First Jewish Revolt of 67 CE. Flavia Neapolis was of Greco-Roman culture, and Justin identifies himself with this culture primarily by his Greek name and his father's Latin name. Justin situates Flavia Neapolis within Syria-Palestine, which was the new name for the area formerly known as Roman Judea, imposed by the Emperor Hadrian after the Second Jewish Revolt, the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132 to 135 CE. This redefining was part of an imperial project which could be described as ethnic cleansing, and also included the resettling of the ruined Jerusalem at the Roman city of Aelia Capitolia. Thus, Justin grew up in a war-torn region suffering under colonial persecution. His relationship to the Samaritan cultural identity, as opposed to the Greco-Roman one, is a hotly debated question. But what is clear is that Justin was a colonial subject. Though he grew up in Greco-Roman culture, he did so among people who practiced, with difficulty, the religion of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Flavia Neapolis is the site of Jacob's well, where Jesus met the Samaritan woman in John 4. From Flavia Neapolis, in Samaria, our details of Justin's whereabouts are sketchy. We know he spent time in Rome, where he's martyred, and probably in Ephesus, in the Roman province of Asia. This is where, according to Eusebius of Caesarea, his dialogue with Trypho the Jew is set. Trypho was a refugee from the recent Bar Kokhba War. It is supposed that their account was written up later, after Justin is settled in Rome, where he makes his appeal to the Emperor Antoninus Pius. In Rome, the Christian community which Justin found himself in would have been a small but rapidly growing constellation of Christian schools and house communities with a high proportion of fellow immigrants from the eastern part of the empire. The practice of those identifying here as followers of Christ was far from uniform, so Justin was part of a vibrant but contested theological environment. So, Justin was a journeyman whose identity is hard to pin down. As Rebecca Lyman has put it, Justin was an Asian immigrant to the West, as well as a convert to a persecuted cult, whose Hellenistic education allowed him to pass in several worlds. Delving deeper into Justin's motivations leads us to inquire further into his biography. What more do we know of the details of his life? This is difficult because Justin preserves few details, and those he does he presents in highly stylized ways. In his dialogue with Trypho the Jew, Justin gives us an account of his conversion which traces his journey through various philosophical sects up until that of the followers of Christ. We know little more about his life other than that he spent time in Ephesus and Rome and died as a martyr under the reign of Marcus Aurelius around 165 CE. The story Justin tells of his conversion is highly significant because of the manner in which he presents himself as a philosopher. The story goes that Justin had been searching for truth and had tried various philosophical schools, including Stoics, Pythagoreans, and Platonists, and he moves from each of these schools for various reasons until he meets an old man who tells him about the Hebrew prophets and Christ. The old man reveals to him that Christ is the center and meaning of the Hebrew prophets, and Justin becomes a follower of Christ, deciding this to be the only and true philosophy. Two things are noteworthy here. One, Trypho did not know Justin was a follower of Christ at the start of their conversation. Trypho engaged Justin in conversation because he was dressed like a philosopher, wearing a philosopher's cloak. This would have been a highly recognizable form of dress, like a dog collar on clergy today. Secondly, the philosopher's cloak is not a ruse. Justin genuinely sees himself as a philosopher, as one who follows the philosophy of Christ. It's important to remember that ancient philosophy was not the private academic pursuit of the modern university. Ancient philosophies were schools of wisdom, and their leaders were more like spiritual directors than professors. Their aim was to help people become good and wise. This is what Justin was seeking on his journey. It's what he had thought he had found in Platonism and what he later discovered in a fuller form in Christ. Scholars are divided as to the veracity and the reliability of the story Justin tells of his quest in the dialogue. Some have noted its similarity to other accounts of the period and count it as a literary fiction. Others take it seriously as more or less historical. The significant factor, however, is that nothing appears in Justin's work unintentionally. Like a great film director in controlling the mise en scene, nothing appears by accident. Everything expresses something significant. So whether the details of his philosophical quest are reliable history or not, they tell us something significant about who he thought he was and how he saw the task of following Christ. That is, as a philosopher. This is one of the few things we can be confident about concerning Justin's self-understanding and identity. Indeed, philosopher is one of the classical characterizations of Justin, along with Martyr. As early as Tertullian, Justin has been understood this way. Different attitudes towards pagan learning are visible in the patristic period, and frequently Justin has been presented as someone who is amenable to the accommodation of Hellenism. Such a view, however, tends to assume a vast gulf between philosophy and religion that would not have been understood and recognized by most people of the period. Rather, Justin is a philosopher because he believes he has found the true way, with good sources, and he teaches it to others. Indeed, one of the ways he sees Christ is as a teacher, and he sees himself as a teacher after Christ, and that's eventually what gets him killed. To make sense of this, we need to understand that not only was it the case that there were different philosophical schools teaching in Justin's period, but there was also a polyphony of voices teaching the way of Christ in ways that did not necessarily cohere or measure up to what we now understand as Orthodox Christianity. Philosophy for Justin was once pure and true, but had become corrupted, and the existence of multiple schools, Platonists and Stoics, etc., was sufficient evidence of this. The philosophy of Christ was not one option among many, but the true and pure philosophy, which encompassed all that was true in philosophy. However, even the philosophy of Christ was vulnerable to corruption by disreputable teachers. In the dialogue, Justin mentions a number of groups with whom he disagrees, including Marcionites and Valentinians. Though such groups all claim to follow Christ, referring to them by the name of the founder of their school, be it Marcion or Valentinus, rather than after Christ, marks these out for Justin as distinct from the Christian philosophy. So being a philosopher was fundamental for Justin. He would not have understood the anachronistic contrast between philosophy and faith. Philosophy for Justin was about public and defensible truth and a practical way of life. It is this philosophy that Justin presents to the emperor and his sons in the hope that they, being committed to rational philosophical principles, may recognize that it is not the baseless superstition that they have been led to believe. Why he had to make such an appeal is answered by considering the ignorance and persecutions Christians were subject to at the time. Justin's response to such ignorance and persecution is in the form of the appeal he makes to the emperor. The particular legal standing and credibility of this appeal is debated, but it takes the shape of a recognized form of address which could have expected an answer. This form of address has led to Justin being traditionally described as an apologist, or even the first and most prominent apologist. An apologist, classically understood, is someone who presents a defense of the faith. Eusebius coined the title in the 4th century to describe the work of Justin, along with others including Aristides, Melito of Sardis, and Tertullian. Each in their own way presented a defense of what Christians believed and how they lived. Justin is an apologist inasmuch as he presents an appeal to the emperor and his sons for a fair hearing and offers an explanation of what it is to follow Christ in support of this appeal. To understand why a fair hearing is necessary, it is worth recounting an example that Justin gives of a Christian trial in his second apology. The story goes that a woman who had become a Christian sought to divorce her abusive and licentious pagan husband. As revenge, he dobbed her into the authorities as a Christian. After she had procured a deferral of her case, her husband then turned in her teacher in the faith, a man named Ptolemy. As it played out, Ptolemy and 2 other Christian bystanders, who all confessed to being Christians, all suffered rough justice merely on account of being Christians. Precedent for such punishment, simply on account of confessing the name of Christ, had existed at least since the time of the Emperor Trajan in the generation before Justin. Justin's own case, which was recorded in the trial records, the Acts of Christian Martyrs, is not dissimilar to that of the woman. He and a group of 6 of his followers were arrested in the year 165 and brought before the city magistrate in Rome. The reason for their arrest is obscure, and the process of the trial takes interest only in the fact of their Christianity. All confess to being Christians, all are beheaded. This is precisely the sort of treatment that Justin sought to counsel against during his lifetime.